Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it about another minute or two and then get started. All right, well, let's get started here. Thank you, everyone, for joining this afternoon. My name is Evan Seaman. I am a land use lawyer at Robinson and Cole in Hartford, and I'm also the chair of CCAPA's program committee. And we're very pleased today to offer this exciting program for you, a planner's primer on adaptive reuse incentives. So today we're going to learn about the historic tax credit programs offered in Connecticut for commercial and homeowner projects. And we'll also hear about some recent case studies and advice that you all as planners and planning professionals can use in your discussion with developers in your respective communities. I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. First, Renee Tribert. Renee joined Preservation Connecticut in 2014 and manages a statewide survey of historic industrial properties. And that website is available through Mills Making Places of CT. And now Renee also provides general preservation services, tax credit application consulting, and networking to encourage and support reuse of historic buildings. And interestingly, Renee also has an extensive extensive experience in environmental consulting. And also Julie Carmelick. Julie is an historian with the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office, better known as SHPO, located within the Department of Economic and Community Development. Since her start at the SHPO in 2008, Julie's primary responsibility has been to administer the state and federal historic rehabilitation tax credit programs. And when not working on tax credit projects, Julie's other duties include monitoring the preservation restriction program. Julie brings over 24 years of professional preservation experience in both the private and public sectors. And before I hand it over to Julie and Renee to get us started, I just wanted to note that we're going to save about 10 minutes at the end for questions. However, what you can do is you'll see that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, right next to where it says participants in chat. And there you can type in a question or comment that you might have so that you don't forget it at the end of the program. And we'll be able to address it at the appropriate time. So with that, let's get into it. Julie, I think you're going to kick us off. So let's get going.
Great, thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Julie Carmelick, as Evan mentioned. I am one of the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Coordinators at the SHPO. And I always like to begin my presentations with a brief description of what the State Historic Preservation Office is and our role in state government. The Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO for short, oversees the governmental program of historic preservation for Connecticut citizens. Our mission is to strengthen communities by identifying and investing in historic places that define our state's character. The SHPO administers many programs, including the National Register of Historic Places, state and federal historic rehabilitation tax credits, and numerous grants and regulatory programs. Annually, the office reviews over 150 tax credit applications, approximately 3,000 projects under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act, and we award over $1 million in grants annually. As Evan mentioned, we're located within the Department of Economic and Community Development, but within DECD, we're part of a cohort that includes the Office of the Arts and the state museums. So why do we invest in historic preservation? What are the benefits of it, and why does the state and federal government offer incentives for the preservation of historic buildings? Studies completed over the past decade, including here in Connecticut, have shown that there are numerous economic and community development benefits to historic preservation. Historic preservation rehabilitation projects create jobs, provide safe, affordable, and workforce housing, and put vacant or underutilized properties back on the local tax rolls. Many historic buildings are used for small businesses and incubator spaces, and they can reactivate storefronts and revitalize downtowns. Other preservation projects provide hotels, daycare centers, medical offices, and other needed businesses for strong, vibrant communities. Year after year, our data shows that for every dollar the state sets aside for the State Historic Rehab Tax Credit Program, over $4 is spent through private investment. A study of the state's economic impact under the federal Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit showed that during federal fiscal year 22, Connecticut projects generated $150.5 million in total rehabilitation costs. This $150 million investment created 2,155 full and part-time jobs, of which over 1,300 were located in Connecticut. The investment also generated $104 million in income nationally, including $66.9 million right here in Connecticut. Additionally, the program recouped over $21 million in federal, state, and local taxes. So it drives the state's economy in many ways, as well as the national economy. The benefits of historic preservation can run deeper than the immediate investment in a rehabilitation project. This spreadsheet shows an economic impact model designed by Camoin Associates for the Connecticut Main Street Center with funding from the SHPO office. It's publicly available through the Connecticut Main Street Center and the SHPO if you're interested in acquiring a copy, and provides an estimate of jobs created per retail square foot, property tax gains on multifamily residential developments, and consumer spending in neighborhoods with recently rehabilitated projects. If anyone ever wonders about the catalytic effect that one rehabbed property can have on a neighborhood, look no further than this spreadsheet. Of course, the same effects can be achieved with new construction, but what is lost with new construction is the character that defines the state and local community. Also, with the loss of every historic building is the loss of its embodied energy. And I'd be remiss if I didn't speak to the environmental impacts of historic preservation. I think it will be increasingly difficult to discuss historic preservation without also considering its environmental impacts and sustainability. Preservation maximizes the use of existing materials and infrastructure, reduces waste, and preserves the historic character of older buildings and towns. The National Trust for Historic Preservation's 2011 The Greenest Building Study found that when comparing buildings of equivalent size and function, building reuse almost always offers environmental savings over demolition and new construction. The study finds that the majority of the building types in different climates will take between 20 to 30 years to compensate for the initial carbon impact of new construction. That is to say, that the most efficient new building constructed today will take over a generation to make up for its initial carbon impact, whereas a historic building can be retrofitted with energy-efficient systems and renewable energy sources without being a further drain on natural resources. The Greenest Building Study is further supported by Architecture 2030's CARE tool. The CARE tool was designed by a nonprofit group of architects called Architecture 2030, dedicated to create zero-emission buildings by 2030. I encourage everyone to check it out, especially when talking about development projects in your community. The tool allows you to plug in building information in order to find out whether reuse of an existing building or new construction will have the greater environmental impact over time. Finally, before I leave this topic, I wanted to mention that a few years ago, the SHPO closed out its Hurricane Sandy Disaster Relief Assistance Grant provided by the National Park Service. With a portion of those funds, we were able to survey and document the state's historic resources vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise. Over 4,000 known architectural and archaeological resources were located in these vulnerable areas. That's a lot of embodied energy and potential economic development at risk. Please, as planners and community leaders, don't hesitate to reach out to us for ways that the SHPO can assist your community in incorporating historic resources into your plans of conservation and development and hazard mitigation plans, and to assist in making these resources more resilient to the effects of climate change. So now let's talk about the SHPO's incentives for historic preservation. So we offer several programs that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention. The state and federal government run 3 historic rehabilitation tax credit programs for properties listed on the state or National Register of Historic Places. I will also talk about the SHPO's grant programs for historic buildings in a later slide. First up is the Historic Homes Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program. The homeowners program, as we like to call it, is available for homeowners of historic properties of 1 to 4 units. The building must be owner occupied and must serve as the owner's primary residence. The credit is equal to 30% of the eligible expenditures up to $30,000 per dwelling unit. The applicant's project must contain a minimum of $15,000 in expenditures. It can be, it's a one-time application of $15,000, but the applicant can come back over and over, provided their application meets the $15,000 expenditure threshold. So you can maximize the value of the credit that way by reapplying over time. Properties must be historic, and that is to say they must be listed on either the state or National Register of Historic Places. All work must meet the program's standards for rehabilitation. And I will talk a little bit more about the National Park Service's standards for rehabilitation in some later slides. And finally, under the Homes program, the historic homeowner can take the credit on their personal income tax. We anticipate a change to the program in the upcoming legislative session, although nothing's final till it's final. But we are hoping that it will allow for the option to sell the tax credit to a contributing taxpayer or investor who will use it to offset their state income tax. So hopefully it will provide 2 options for use in the future. The next state tax credit program is the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program, or what we often refer to as the commercial tax credit. This is the larger of the 2 programs, really intended to be for larger, more development-oriented projects. In this program, the tax credit provides a 25% tax credit on rehabilitation projects that follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And again, we'll talk more about that later. There's an additional 5% in tax credits, so you could potentially receive up to 30% if the project has an affordable housing component or is located in a federally designated opportunity zone. This program is not a maintenance and repair program. It's intended to put vacant or underutilized buildings back in service, and a certificate of occupancy is required at the end of the project. Like the Homes program, properties must be listed on either the state or National Register of Historic Places. But unlike the homeowners program, this credit is intended to be sold to a C corporation that would use it to offset their state income tax. Because the program allows for the sale of the credit, nonprofits and municipalities are eligible to apply, as well as private developers. There is a cap on this program of $31.7 million that is distributed annually on the fiscal year, so it starts July 1st. And the $31.7 million is the amount of money with which our office is able to reserve tax credits for a particular reserve tax credits for all of its projects. there is a $4.5 million project cap with which we can reserve for single projects. So a single project can get up to $4.5 million in tax credits. The final tax credit program is the federal tax credit program, which is run by the National Park Service in conjunction with the IRS. The SHPO serves as a liaison between the applicant and the National Park Service. All inquiries about the program and applications to the program come to the SHPO first. The federal historic tax credit offers a 20% credit on eligible expenditures. In the federal program, eligible expenditures include all the hard costs associated with the rehabilitation of the structure, excluding site work and acquisition costs. But it does include some soft costs, including architectural fees, developer fees, and consulting fees. In order to qualify for the federal tax credit program, the property must be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The State Register of Historic Places, which we mentioned previously, is an independent program from the National Register and is applied to our state programs. But for the federal tax credit program, the properties have to be listed on the National Register, which is a slightly higher threshold. Like the historic rehab tax credit, though, the program must meet the standards for rehabilitation. Properties must be income producing post-rehab, and the tax credit must be used by a person or entity with an ownership stake in the property and cannot be sold to an outside investor, unlike the state program that we mentioned earlier. So I wanted to talk just briefly about the application process. So you might be able to answer some questions as you talk to potential developers or potential property owners. All the tax credit programs have a multi-part application process. Illustrated here are the federal tax credit and the larger commercial tax credit process. Unlike the federal program, approval of the rehabilitation plan prior to undertaking the work is required for both state tax credit programs. Although the NPS strongly encourages applicants to apply to the program before starting construction, it's not a requirement under the federal program. If you're working with a potential tax credit applicant, please be sure to prepare them for the application review times. These are not emergency repair programs, and approval can take up to 30 days to get through the system, and even longer if they're also applying to the federal program. Because remember, the applications come to the SHPO first, and then they go on to the Park Service. So each of us has 30 days to complete our review. Finally, I just want to take a moment to give a shout out to the SHPO's new online GS mapping system, ConCRIS. If you haven't checked it out, I really recommend that you do it. It can help you identify historic properties that are listed on the state or national register. It identifies properties that are under our easement program and properties that have just been surveyed by local municipal surveys. So it's a really useful tool to help you identify potential historic resources in your area. And if you'd like, and you can also use the system to incorporate maps of historic resources into planning documents. So if you haven't already looked at it, take a look. It's a really useful tool, and the website's down there at the bottom of the presentation. So before moving away from the SHPO's financial incentives, I just wanted to mention several grant programs that can assist with the preservation of historic resources. All grants are available to municipalities and nonprofits. They can fund anything from state and national register nominations to plans and specs for capital improvements, feasibility studies, and planning documents. We also have a capital grant called the Historic Restoration Fund Grant that is also available for capital projects. Most are matching reimbursable grants, and each program has its own funding levels, but they typically range from $5,000 for the smallest survey and planning grant to $200,000 for a Historic Restoration Fund Grant, and anywhere in between, obviously. Be sure to check out the SHPO's website for more information about our grants and for the contact information for the grant coordinator. Or if you have any questions after this presentation, feel free to reach out to me and I can get you in contact with the person who would best help you with a grant program. Finally, as with all of our funding opportunities, early communication is key. If you are working with a potential applicant, please encourage them to reach out to the SHPO as early as possible to help ease the application process. Now, in anticipation of some questions from all of you guys, I just wanted to briefly talk about the standards for rehabilitation, which I'd mentioned earlier as our guidelines by which we use to approve and review rehabilitation projects under the tax credit program. So the National Park Service created the standards for the treatment of historic buildings, which are a set of 4 standards or guidelines for the treatment of historic properties. They are the basis under which the National Park Service, SHPOs across the country, and local historic district commissions evaluate the effects of undertakings on historic properties. The standards for rehabilitation are one of those 4 sets of standards. The rehab standards are the most flexible and most frequently used of the 4 treatments. When applied to historic buildings, the rehab standards allow for a new use in the building or a continued use without jeopardizing its ability to remain on the National or State Register of Historic Places. So, as I mentioned, the rehab standards are a set of guidelines. There are 10 rehab standards. I'm not going to go through all of them, which you'll thank me for, I'm sure. But the basic guidelines include recommendations to repair historic building material rather than replace it, or when repair is not possible, the recommendation is to replace the material in kind. The rehab standards are intended to preserve the essential character of the building's historic use. That is to say, the reuse needs to preserve the spaces and finishes that identify the building's historic use. For example, some of the characteristics of a historic school building include long, wide corridors, tall windows, high ceilings, and classroom doors with transom lights above. The public spaces include auditoriums and gymnasiums. When evaluating a proposed rehabilitation in a historic school building, the SHPO and NPS will be looking to ensure that many of these features are preserved, while keeping in mind that there will need to be a balance between the old and the new. And that's the important piece to the standards for rehabilitation, is finding that balance and understanding that all changes to a building through rehabilitation are cumulative. And we just want to make sure that the balance is tipping towards preservation and not towards a rehab that will strip the building of all its character. So that is the rehab standards in a nutshell. And with that, I will stop sharing and hand it over to Renee. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. All right, let's see if I can. Okay. So hopefully you are seeing now my presentation screen. Oh, good afternoon. I'm Renee Trabert with Preservation Connecticut. And I'm going to kind of build on Julie's introduction to historic tax credits and their benefits with some case studies and thoughts for municipal officials on promoting redevelopment of historic buildings in your community. First, though, I'd like to introduce Preservation Connecticut. For those of you who don't know us, we are the statewide nonprofit advocate for the preservation and reuse of historic buildings. We have a staff of 9, including our circuit riders who are field staff. They can meet on site to discuss building concerns, offer guidance on how to address those concerns, and suggest potential resources such as some of the SHPO programs that Julie mentioned that are available, by the way, to municipalities, like the Certified Local Government Grants, Survey and Planning Grants, Historic Restoration Fund grants. We also manage 2 matching grant programs, one for churches and one for nonprofits. And we assist homeowners of historic properties to protect them through easements. Our other programs include training for historic district commissions in collaboration with SHPO staff, tours and events at historic places. On May 4th, you can look for Jane's Walks, a series of walks that are inspired by New York City's activist Jane Jacobs. We have workshops for children and adults, annual preservation awards, our Wednesday noontime virtual talk series called Talking About Preservation. That round will start in the next round in May. And we also have survey information available on our various websites. And we share preservation news and updates in our bi-monthly newsletter and social media. So now I'm going to start with the case studies highlighting different types of projects, from a small community effort to a complex mill redevelopment. So this is the first case study. It's a local theater group that brought live entertainment back to a beloved historic theater. Built in 1914 as Idle Hours Moving Theater, and later used for live people and puppet theater productions, it had been vacant since around 2000. Legacy Theater Group bought and secured the building in 2013, and then pursued fundraising for the broader rehab project. The group was able to raise around $4 million from private, corporate, and foundation donors. The exterior facade was restored, but on the inside, the needs of a modern stage venue required extensive renovation. So the interior was basically gutted in order to install new sound and lighting equipment, a proscenium stage, 127 seats, and a recording studio. Now, the group worked with Julie on a program that met the rehabilitation standards for the building's continuing use as a theater. And they were able thus to tap the state historic tax credits, which were fairly significant at $875,000. The next case study is a modest downtown commercial building rehabbed for mixed commercial and residential use. Built in 1924, in the late 1920s, this building on Green Street in New London housed offices of 2 Black activist organizations, the United Negro Welfare Council and the New York People's Finance Corporation. Unfortunately, by 2020, the building was vacant. So, working with municipal officials, Parker Benjamin, the developer, identified the need for affordable housing for students and people entering the workforce. The units here rent out at $1,000 per month. So, and as you can see from the photographs, this is not a luxury rehab. According to the developer, some benefits of working in New London include the fact that the community has 8 existing state and national register historic districts, which allow for speedier processing of tax credits. So in other words, a developer may not have to go through the process of determining if a building is eligible and then also writing a nomination in order to gain access to the tax credits. He also noted that the city has a strategic department and commission meeting schedule that helps streamline the municipal review process. So I understand, for example, that there are historic district commission meetings to occur 1 to 2 days before planning and zoning meetings. The project benefited from other municipal programs. There's a 0% interest roof revolving loan fund, which helps secure the building envelope. And there's a facade easement program, which in this case paid for windows. An enterprise zone incentive allowed because it's a commercial property, it allowed the owners to lock the property taxes at the pre-construction level for 2 years. Finally, the developer noted that SHPO staff added insight and value during the review process on construction-related issues so that they could easily find the path to the tax credits. As you can see here, the total project cost of $1.246 million, and the federal and state historic tax credits were far and away the greatest incentives at $623,000. Next, we have a high school, a former high school. Wind Development tackled the reuse of a 1936 high school building with the goal of reaching the highest level of sustainability and energy efficiency, while also meeting the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, and obtaining state and federal historic tax credits. This was the first rehab in the country to be evaluated as a passive project. The program was to create a senior community complex with amenities such as a lounge, movie theater, fitness room, and classrooms, as well as supportive services. It has an affordable housing component with rents ranging from $423 to $1,610 a month. The project effectively integrated elements such as solar panels, energy-efficient windows, and appliances while retaining historic features like classroom layout, lockers, the exposed terrazzo flooring, large windows, and the restoration of the cupola. The building uses 20% less energy than average Energy Star construction. And by reusing the building, the project estimates a savings of 18,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions during construction. The original building had 2 additions dating to 1964 and 1973. The later addition was outside of the period of significance that considered for the tax credits, for the nominations and the tax credits. And so that building could be taken down in favor of a courtyard and a parking lot. The auditorium, gym, and pool associated with the high school remain property of the city and will be used for broader community activities. So here's the capital stack for this project. It cost $31.7 million, and you can see how the low-income housing tax credit and the historic tax credits were used to leverage investor equity. So tax credits, as you may know, are not issued until after satisfactory completion of the project. So they're sometimes sold to investors, typically at a rate of something like 80 to 90 cents on the dollar. And the developer has access to cash for construction. The investors, on the other hand, receive the full value of the tax credit at the end of the project. So here, the historic incentives brought $8.93 million in equity to the project. Now, this is, you probably are familiar with this, a very complex mill redevelopment project. The massive Montgomery Mill property is located between the Connecticut River to the east and the Enfield Canal to the west. The map here is oriented with west at the top. The canal was built to bypass the Enfield Falls, but also to bring hydropower to mills along it during the 19th century. And in fact, I believe one of the factories further downstream still uses the water from the canal. The canal towpath is now a linear trail, and you can see the downtown area is just beyond on the west side of the canal. J.R. Montgomery Company occupied the site from 1871 through 1989, and the buildings here date to 1891, 1904, and 1920. And this is a large complex, large square footage. The company made specialty tinsel threads, yarns, and later in the 20th century, communication wires and electronic components. And after Montgomery, they had some moderate use, but the buildings were mostly vacant for years. And I think of this as a great example of the adage, it takes a village. So here, municipal officials recognize the importance of the mill, a local landmark, to any economic development goals for the downtown area. They laid the groundwork for redevelopment by undertaking studies, creating a zoning overlay for the Main Street area, adopting a TIF or tax increment financing policy, and creating adaptive reuse regulations. And Amtrak announced in 2010 plans to build a new station. The the town also conducted a TOD study in which it prioritized the mill in the sequencing of activities such as infrastructure capital improvements. In 2019, the town also obtained a $2.9 million Complete Streets Award for the Main Street area to complement the mill rehab. So this project had to overcome all of the challenges of mill redevelopment and then some. USTs and contaminated soil, the abatement of hazardous building materials, a basement level in a 100-year floodplain with a history of flooding, life safety code compliance issues, a tight site with single access point, difficult circulation, and emergency vehicle access. So in addition to the broader planning mentioned above, the town offered direct project support. It had obtained a municipal brownfield award for assessment in 2015. It was awarded an Urban Act grant loan and a brownfield loan, both of which were turned over to the developer through secondary loans. The brownfield grant loan from the town to the developer has a 1% interest rate and a 20-year term with no repayment until maturity. And there is the possibility that a portion may be forgiven by the state. And the Urban Act loan from the town has a 40-year term, again, with no repayment until maturity. The town also offered a reduction in the per unit cost of sewer main connection. And under the TIF policy, it agreed to split the incremental property taxes realized over 10 years from the increased value of the property post-rehab. And it's important to note here that this project has really had a significant positive impact on the community, helping to revitalize downtown Windsor Locks. So here's the financial stack. Beacon Communities was able to monetize the 9% LIHTC. So again, they had affordable unit, an affordable component to the residential units, as well as the federal and state historic tax credits and the TIF district loan all through investor syndication. The historic tax incentives brought in $21.9 million in equity. Eversource purchased the state historic tax credits upon project completion. Now, historically, the company has been purchasing tax credits on a dollar-to-dollar basis, all to support community development. It purchases other tax credits, such as the Housing Tax Credit Contributions Program through CHFA, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, the Neighborhood Assistance Act credits through the DRS, Revenue Services, and the Urban and Industrial Sites Reinvestment Tax credits through DECD. For projects that anticipate millions in state historic tax credits, the developer should initiate a discussion about the potential tax credit purchase with Eversource once they've received a Part 2 approval. Eversource's purchase and sales agreement process won't start until a Part 3 has actually been approved and the tax credits are reserved. When the developer receives the voucher and sells it to Eversource through the Part 5 application, getting the voucher, Eversource has said that the developer can generally anticipate on the order of a month to receive the funds from Eversource. On this project, Beacon Communities identified the most challenging aspects of assembling the capital stack as the LIHTC allocation, the DOH loan, and locating the equity investors for the tax credits. That said, the financing was in place within about 1.5 years of starting the process of looking at this rehab. So it was quite remarkable, actually. Okay, now I just want to touch on some general tools and tactics. And these are all going to be familiar to you, I think, because they certainly aren't unique to the adaptive use of historic buildings, but they can move those projects along just as well, those rehab projects. Pre-development feasibility studies, often done by developers, but a municipality can do that to tee a building up for rehab. The same thing with sewer and water infrastructure projects. If you're looking at encouraging rehab of particular buildings, that's another to set the project up. Identify your planning and zoning strategies for historic buildings in your POCDs. Working with state agencies, the local community, and legislators, build support for a rehab project. You've already seen in these case studies the importance for redevelopment of layering the incentives. Helping the developer work through permits in parallel tracks. One that can be important for historic commercial industrial buildings is the use under certain circumstances of the building as a tool to prevent the migration of soluble contaminants. And it's part of an overall remedial strategy, which usually will involve an environmental land use restriction, but it relies upon the building to protect the contaminated soil beneath. Can't always be used, but it is a tool. So now I thought I would sort of talk about some broad stroke things that municipal officials can do to support and encourage adaptive reuse of historic buildings in your towns. Some of this Julie's already talked about. You probably already know some of this, but know the buildings in your community that are listed on the state or national register and identify those that aren't, but that may be candidates and that you see as redevelopment targets. You can apply for a survey and planning grant from SHPO for nominations or to establish historic districts. The lack of a historic designation can at the very least delay and sometimes actually at worst stop projects because of the importance of that layering of incentives, including the state and federal historic incentives. Consider zoning overlays for industrial heritage or historic design, which, as you know, can modify the requirements to streamline the guidelines for P&Z review of rehabs and make reuse more attractive. I feel like something like 40 communities already do that, have those kinds of zones. Maybe it's even more. Look into adopting a tax abatement ordinance for historic structures in the community. That's the CGS 12-127A authorizing statute. It's for smaller projects, but I know that Middletown has adopted that and they have used it twice now to assist private owners of historic buildings. So that might be a tool to consider. Other ways that municipal officials can help. For projects that may be eligible for historic tax credits, encourage developers to reach out to SHPO staff well before they begin formally seeking municipal approvals. If the first time that you become aware of a proposed rehab project is when they come to the municipal offices about it, about permits, still send them over if they haven't already done so. As Julie said, it's really important to talk to her first or early on. You all probably know that a rehab project that may have municipal approvals, but for which a developer hasn't had a discussion with SHPO, even though they're intending to go for the tax credits, can wind up with significant delays due to possible need in changing the rehab program, going back to the drawing board on some aspects of the program. Similarly, encourage early discussion between the project architect and the building official and fire marshal on paths to code compliance for historic buildings. Your local officials may have experience with similar projects that can inform approaches for the project at hand. And that's about it for my thoughts and ideas on this. Julie and I are happy to take any questions that you may have.
Julie and Renee, thank you so much for that excellent presentation, extremely informative. And we'll give our folks just a couple minutes to type out any questions that they might have in the Q&A box at the bottom. But as we're waiting, I guess I had a question, and that is, kind of building off Renee, you mentioning the ways in which municipalities and planners can help spread the word. Do you both generally find that knowledge in the types of incentives that are available are that it's lacking on behalf of homeowners and commercial property owners, or do you think most, or I guess a good percentage of them actually are aware of these programs and some of the specifics about them?
I think we could always do a better job of educating homeowners for sure. The program had started out as only available in targeted areas and has since moved statewide. But the bulk of our applications are still coming from places like Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport. So I think we could definitely be doing some more education for the homeowners credit. I think savvy developers know about the incentives that are available to them. But there are some, small downtown property owners, for example, who don't. And getting the word out to them would always be a good idea. Because there are so many downtowns that are historic and in Connecticut, and it would certainly be, it would be too bad if they missed out on a financial incentive that could help them. Do you have anything to add, Renee?
No, not really. Yes, exactly as Julie says. I mean, the larger developers know the ins and outs, and they know how to syndicate, and they know all of these things. The smaller, perhaps more local developers don't necessarily. I know that, for example, we conducted a site visit at a school rehab project because the developer was interested in the possibility of historic tax credits. One of the things I don't recall if you mentioned it, Julie, but something that's really important in tax credit projects is that you don't do any work prior to consultation with SHPO, because you have to, in order for the project to go through, you have to have an approval of the plan. And if a developer does some work and the plan hasn't been approved, then basically you've kind of jeopardized the ability, not kind of, I guess you've just jeopardized the ability to get those tax credits. And so, we went out to speak to a developer working on a school rehab and interested in the tax credits. And we got there and demo had begun. And, sadly, we had to say, you're not eligible. You've already removed some of the character defining features and materials. And so that's it. That's an important thing. Not everybody necessarily knows. And even if they hear it, they don't necessarily kind of understand it. So I agree with Julie.
We had a question come in, and this was one I was going to ask as well, sort of along these lines. Are there good examples of any historic preservation zoning overlay standards that have been established by communities that you're aware of, or is there a model regulation out there somewhere? Anything in terms of resources available for those those communities that are considering amending their zoning codes in some way to touch on these issues that you've discussed?
Yeah. So I was looking for my list. Somewhere I have a list that was compiled. So for example, Putnam has a, what do they call it? A mill redevelopment area zone, I think. There is a list that I have access to, and that's something that I don't know how I can do this, Evan. I can share it. Maybe I can share it with you so that you can share it with your cohort.
Sure.
But yes, there are municipalities that have already, implemented those.
And we have a question, Julie, about CONCRIS, and that is if someone notices a discrepancy in CONCRIS between, what might actually be out there on the ground, who should they contact to resolve that discrepancy?
Sure. So I believe there is a feedback a link in the Congress system where you can provide feedback for just that situation. But we also have a GIS specialist who is updating the maps and inputting regularly. And if you want to look online, his name is Kevin Berger. But if you want to get in touch with me, I can put you in touch with him if that might be easier. So, but yes, we are constantly updating. So please, if you have feedback, let us know.
Thank you. And it looks like actually someone in the chat box shared Putnam's overlay
Yeah.
district. There you go.
Thank you, Tara.
Renee, you also mentioned trainings, and Julie, I'm not sure if you offer this, your office provides this as well, but for those planners or town officials out there looking to, I guess, learn more after today, what options, or their agencies, what options are out there that you might be able to provide?
Well, we certainly are happy to, come. I mean, if there's the trainings that I mentioned are for historic district commissions, and they are done in collaboratively with SHPO. But we're certainly happy to either have circuit riders or whomever come out and speak with municipal officials. Because actually that's a goal that we have. That's one way that we feel like we can spread the information and knowledge about the incentives that are available, about the processes for tax credits, about, all of that stuff. So we're happy to do that. So folks can reach out to Preservation Connecticut. They can reach out to me to see about organizing something. We could probably even organize like some kind of a, noontime session. I mentioned we have those noontime talks, but we could do something Zoom like that if that would be useful for folks. So, I'd be happy to, Preservation Connecticut would be happy to do something like that. Or one-on-ones if that's what, visits, if that's what municipal officials want.
And I'll also add that, I am a public servant and I take that very seriously. So anybody who wants to know more about the tax credit programs, either through a workshop or a meeting, give me a call. I don't have time to plan them regionally or with any frequency, but I certainly will come anytime somebody asks. So don't hesitate.
And I hope that you'll both be willing to come back in the future for another presentation like this to train some more people. I think it's been a very eye-opening program. And I know I, for one, have learned a lot. So thank you both very much for being a part of this.
Good. Thank you
My
all for
pleasure.
having us.
Yeah, happy to come back.
Yeah.
So I think we're a couple minutes early, but it looks like all of the questions have been answered. So I think you've done an excellent job, and look forward to studying this stuff a little bit more and seeing how it works once implemented. So thank you again.
Great. And I'll
Thank
send that
you.
list for you, Evan.
Thanks so much. I'll share it with everybody. All right. Take care.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.